Hi, everyone. We're group 4. This is our articles on mitigating the dangers of a single story, creating large-scale writing assessments aligned with sociocultural theory by Nadia Behizadeh. We're just going to go around and introduce ourselves. I can go first. My name is Rachel. I am an English as a second language teacher at a community center in Dorchester during the school year. And this summer, I'm working with teenagers. So I kind of do adult ed, community education, or ESL education, and then I work with teenagers and usually in art, but a lot of different settings.
Hi, everyone. My name's Spencer. I taught at a middle school the past 2 years, teaching 6th grade ELA. And this next school year, I'll be teaching high schoolers, and I will be in the role of a language interventionalist. So I'm excited for that new role. Kind of fits with our program as well. And that'll be 9 through 12.
I'll go next. Hey everyone, my name is Ryan. I work with adult ESL learners in Boston as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Maria. I'm currently a full-time Appling student getting my master's degree in ESL licensure. Before this, I worked in Japan teaching elementary school, teaching English to elementary schoolers for 2 years. So that's my background.
Awesome. Well, we were saying that we'll just go around and just kind of give our thoughts on the article that we read and some of the readings, and we'll share there.
I can start. So I think for me, this article really resonated with me. I think it's sort of goes on sort of a long-standing theme of the course is like there are assessments out there that for English language learners, and oftentimes they aren't exactly assessing what we think they're assessing, and they're not as sort of culturally sustaining as they could be, and they aren't sort of recognizing multiple different types of literacies and that sort of thing. I'd also seen this video from Chimamanda Adichie from The Danger of the Single Story, which I'm assuming you probably all have as well. And I really enjoyed it. And so it's nice to sort of see the themes from that played out in other places here, sort of in writing assessment. I do definitely have some questions about maybe some of the implementation and just less about sort of not agreeing with it, but more like when push comes to shove, how do we get this to work in practice in our classrooms? So I'd be curious to hear all of your thoughts on that as well. Somebody else want to go next?
I also agree. I have some critiques that we might go into later, but overall, I like underlying ideology and intentions behind this. Like, you don't want to reinscribe your students into a stereotype or the type of student they are defined by one grade, one standardized test, right? But at the same time, like when it was in the social cultural writing assessment wants to, like, the underlying ideology is that it wants students to relate to their writing assessments, right? Like, it has to be relevant to them. That's what social, cultural, and still culturally sustaining pedagogy is, to be able to relate to students. But when I think about like college readiness, you know, all these standards that are supposed to prepare you for colleges and careers, like at what point in college, like academic writing in college is hardly about the self. There's so much more about like critiquing, synthesizing, evaluating text. Not everything is going to be relevant to you or can be personally relatable to you. So how does that fit into these kind of like college ready standards when not all of the assessment and all the writing is catered to that?
Well, I feel like a lot of these assessments and just like the idea that Chimamanda used in her Danger of a Single Story TED Talk kind of create this like cookie cutter assumption with assessments or with the literature that's used in the classroom. And I get the point of it to some extent. Like, I get the point of using standards. I get the point of having these assessments that are kind of cookie cutter, but at the same time, it really is an inconvenience and it's a disadvantage to our students. And so I think that at some point, it kind of becomes like the teacher's prerogative to determine what is best for their student. And that's maybe where there's a disconnect, because teachers might not know how, or they might not know that they can make adjustments to the assessments or to the standards And then of course they have to follow specific guidelines based on what their school or what their local district says with the standards that can also create some discrepancies and consequences, right, for our students.
Yeah, I definitely relate, hear you on that and relate to that. I think with some initial thoughts about the reading as well for me was that I appreciate the author's creativity and just like approach and idea, or vision is what she calls it. And I think it's a great idea to think outside the box and have, this idea of all these different portfolio, different writing samples to make a more holistic picture of the student. Totally appreciate that. I think Ryan similarly to what you said, I definitely have questions about how that would be implemented. I'm curious, thoughts on all that, and just curious, like, yeah, what would that look like? What are, practically speaking, what would that look like in the classroom, and what are some challenges that might arise from that? What are some benefits that would arise from that?
No, I agree. I feel like reading through this article, I was like, oh my gosh, this seems like such a cool idea. I love how this could be implemented, but how would I do it? And so I have some questions about that as well, like connecting how I would do it in the classroom to how do I still follow the pacing guides that are required for my district, or how do I still follow the standards that I have to align my students' growth with? I think that's kind of where the concern comes in. It's like, I love this kind of ideal structure, but how do I bring the reality to it so that it still fits?
Have you used writing samples or a student writing portfolio, Spencer, before? I know you had said you did ELA classes in the
Yeah,
past.
they've created their portfolios, but that it wasn't aligned with any assessment or any standard. So like I had them do it personally, but it wasn't a required thing for them. So there wasn't too much buy-in because students kind of just go based on, oh, there's a grade attached to this. Okay, I have to do it. Right. But yeah, what about you guys? Have you had a opportunity to do something like this?
I haven't in my classroom. It's something I think that I would like to do, but I
Yeah.
sort of think, it seems one of the things that came up was that, sort of embodied in sociocultural theory is this idea that you write for different genres, different contexts, different audiences. And then when it got to the end of the article, it was like, okay, there's 3 writing samples. And I was like, well, which 3? Like what sort of the 3 things that I want to include, and how would I be confident from there that this would be like, okay, this is a solid assessment of students writing at this point. I suppose we really haven't like talked about like the fact that like often these include a reflection portion as well. But I also think, and I don't know if we were talking about this either when the discussion was recorded or beforehand, but like it's clear to me that some type of reflection would be good, but it seems like that should also be structured in its own way to sort of guide students into the types of things they want to reflect on.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely, I agree. Here's a slide of kind of an example that the writer gives in an 8th grade writing portfolio. So if you see, there are 3 samples that she suggests collecting as part of this portfolio. 2 of them are in standard American English. It could be different genres, and the 3rd could be written in any dialect or language the student wants, but the only thing that's graded is that reflection that you're referring to, Ryan. And yeah, I was thinking as a teacher, I mean, I would have to teach my students how to write that reflection as well. And
Totally.
And that's a whole, I mean, and I was thinking, oh man, like all the genres that, I would have to cover, I mean, would want to cover as well. And so I think there's that thing about how assessments can drive teaching as well. But I think it would definitely be interesting to think about, how do I teach this reflection so that students are critically thinking about, what is the impact of their writing, and then also having to grade that, especially for the sample 3 for the dialect that maybe I don't understand or I don't read. I think is an interesting thing.
Yeah, truthfully, when I read like the reflection was the only thing that was going to be graded in sample 3, that was like up to students' liberties for whatever genre or language, dialect, multimodality they wanted to choose. I was like, if you're only going to grade the reflection, then what is the point of the piece? Like, how are you going to use this to inform instruction or provide feedback? Because like, so that means that if reflection is the only thing that is going to be graded, are you only going to like, is the only thing that will inform future instruction like how to write better reflections? And especially since the reflections themselves will be written in Standard American English, SAE, then what is the point of having this, you know, culturally appropriate and culturally relevant to the self piece of work that the student submits, right? And also, since it's not going to be graded, how are you going to provide feedback for the work? Like, the article also mentions that, like, okay, the teacher is not necessarily going to be fluent in whatever language or modality that the work is going to be presented in. So how is the student going to improve the work, or where is the feedback going to come from for sample 3 then? Like, how is, and can you go, maybe it's the previous slide, Rachel? Yeah, so other languages or dialects of English are encouraged, linguistic diversity is honored. So I think there's like a difference between like and the article throws both of these terms around kind of interchangeably. This like honoring and celebrating linguistic diversity is one, and then like supporting their language development, their first language, and that is two different things, right? So one, honoring, you could just like, I mean, by showcasing that like your language and your piece of work can be used as a form of assessment, that's honoring, right? That's showing that you are not a single story, you have multiple literacies that you could showcase. But development is another thing, developing their home primary discourses or native languages. Like, if you're only going to grade the reflection, how are you developing those, you know, their L1s or their primary languages? I just don't see like how that connects. Like, you would only be teaching to how to write better reflections.
So I guess my takeaway from the reflection is maybe that it would show that students are thinking about the types of things that they would need to be thinking to be solid writers. So like that they wrote for the particular genre, for a particular impact to a particular audience. I think getting back to Rachel's point though, if you don't teach these things and also how to write it in a reflection, it's not going to be a very valid assessment. The reflection could be just, you know, I enjoyed writing this piece or whatever, you know, which may be useful in its own right, but maybe isn't sort of assessing the things that we want to assess here.
Yeah, I feel like if done correctly, the reflection could be used to open a conversation maybe between the teacher and the student on how their portfolio creation or their writing assessment went. But if, like you said, we don't model the teaching of how to make a reflection or how to write a reflection, it could just kind of be a bust. And in that case, there is no point to grade the reflection element, because we're not, or we shouldn't be grading them on their skill in writing reflections solely. It should be on the other elements as well that's related to the actual skills or content.
Yeah. You bring an interesting point up that I think the article brought up and some of our readings from this week brought up, is kind of this like iterative process or the cycle where students are involved in the process of their writing. And yeah, so I mean, I think that's something that the reflection is attempting to do, and which I appreciate. And it's just really a matter of how it comes out. Is, does it promote dialogue with teachers and students? Does it cause students to think about the impact of their own writing instead of just like regurgitating what they feel like is the right thing to write?
Yeah, it also sort of evoked for me, I think, going off that same point, Rachel, like for some readings earlier in the year of like the year, it's been a long year, different of assessment as learning, or I might be getting the particular one wrong, of like students being agents of sort of being involved in choosing the type of assessment and evaluation they do, and sort of reflecting on their own work, and then becoming and having sort of a an active voice in collaboration with the teacher on the types of things that they produce and the assessments that they make. It definitely seems like a portfolio is one way to go about this, particularly if a student has a choice in sort of what can be included in the portfolio. Again, I think it sort of comes back to the question for me of like, are there certain things we'd want to include in a portfolio, particularly as it relates to sort of covering standards or goals that we might have either in our local context or from, the state.
I was just going to say, based on like restrictions or limitations within your own school culture or context, whatever that might be, do you find that this might be more difficult because of those limitations? Like, so for example, I have to follow a specific set of assessments and curriculum and standards. And so for that reason, I'm not allowed to deviate from it. And so I feel like it would be hard for me to incorporate something like this, even though I would really want to. If I were to, it wouldn't be for a grade. It wouldn't be for, it would basically just be for me to determine next steps in my instruction, but there wouldn't really be any like grade benefit to it. So I feel pretty restricted in that sense. Is there any similarity with you all?
I also wanted to comment on like this restriction and limitation, and also tying back to what you were bringing about like discrepancies and disconnects earlier, Spencer, is like I think writing itself, like the product and the process, is subjective, right? And like by trying to create this uniform standard or rubric, you're trying to achieve this objectivity that is already in juxtaposition and contradiction to the subjectivity that writing embodies. Like writing itself is something that appeals to our emotions, right? And our subjectivities and our experiences, our identities. When we come and approach a text, we respond to text emotionally. We're moved, we're entertained, humored, angered, inspired. And it's like thinking about this in terms of a college admissions essay, right? Like the same essay is not going to appeal to different readers in the same way because we're different people. We don't have a single story when we come to read the same text. And so like by creating this uniform standard, like how does that, how do we reach this objectivity in grading when the whole writing process and the product itself is based on subjectivities?
Yeah, absolutely. The entire precipice of writing, I feel like, is based on your creativity and your ability to interpret texts in different ways. And so I agree with you. How can we pick one standard or a certain set of standards to grade so many different minds and so many different experiences and so many different pathways when they're all coming into the classroom? All of our students are coming into the classroom. You're coming into the classroom with a completely different background that should be celebrated and should be shown as a advantage, right? But with those cookie cutter standards, it kind of really isn't.
That also relates something that I wanted to bring up. Like, what do you guys think about how the weighing is, what do you guys think about the lines that are drawn with how much a certain section weighs? Like, do you think it's arbitrary that the first two SAE written samples are worth like 80% and the last reflection is 20%? Do you think that's appropriate? Would you change it? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's definitely an interesting question. I don't have a direct answer to you about that, but I do think, I mean, there is kind of the balance that's happening, or what is trying to be achieved in this change, I guess. Seems like A is to teach American Standard English still, to like give space for multiliteracies and like try to develop that, or at least value it. But then there's this, what is the balance of that? And I don't have an answer to that. I wonder if, how she came up with this percentage as well, if it was kind of just like, let's just choose 3, or if there was actually if there was reasoning behind it as well. Yeah, it just seems like there's like, it's more standard American English than the non-standard, but let's not like make the non-standard worth nothing, is how it feels to me.
I think this may have come up in the Brown and Abewick-Rama reading from this week of like how to sort of weight different features of writing. So we can see here there's sort of like ideas, organization style, conventions, and they showed that some sort of did like across the board like 20%, 20%, 20%. Others sort of weighted different things, like maybe the multimodal effectiveness more or less so. I think when you sort of weight it like that, you're making an implicit claim about like what's more or less important, you know? But at the end of the day, you also have to make a decision of like, I need to, if I'm giving this sort of a grade in this way, if I'm sort of giving it some type of criterion that I'm going to give back to my students, I need to do it somehow, you know? So I think one way around this is to sort of recognize the way in which the grading is imperfect, you know, and sort of to communicate that, I'm giving more weight to this, to XYZ category, although it's sort of downweighting some of these things, which are also maybe important in their own way. And I think maybe, and this is just my own idea, you can mitigate that through other types of feedback, like written feedback or other types of encouragement or, different types of assessment.
Well, I think we're reaching the our time limit of this discussion. I think there's definitely a lot more to discuss.
No, definitely a good discussion. I look forward to continuing it in the written comments from the class. And,
Awesome.
yeah.
Everyone, thank you all for your discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.